Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. Before I get into introducing today's guest, of which I am certain you will enjoy, I wanted to talk a bit about something that I had mentioned in a previous episode, which is I am currently teaching a public oral communications class that has a science and history and philosophy of science focus. And the problem I've been faced with is how to teach a general public oral communications class to students that is essentially themed in the history and philosophy of science. And one thing I came across through conversation with the excellent Katie Kearns at the Center for Innovation, Teaching, and Learning here at Indiana University is the idea of shifting the class not so much on focusing on public oral communication and then tossing in some science issues and maybe teaching it such that introduce the certain contexts in which scientists might speak. And so let's say teaching how to give a talk at a scientific lecture, which is certainly apropos and important, but more so in order flipping it such that we really try to understand the nature of science and how science works. And through that, we come to understand the importance of how science is communicated. And so by trying to understand how science works and through how it's communicated, we understand important principles in terms of public oral communication. And one of the ways I want to do this is by looking at the recent Facebook group page and project, which is the March for Science Facebook page. So if you guys don't know about this, this is a Facebook group that was formed, I forget exactly who it was developed by, but it was developed in response to the recent presidential elections and the recent fears of a number of scientists and science enthusiasts that the support for the sciences would be decreased in the coming, in the short term and in the long term. And so just as there's been a lot of other marches going on in protest of recent politics here in the U.S., there is an increased focus and just as much a focus in basically a march for science. So this is what is read on not the Facebook page, but the website page. So it starts out by saying March for Science, Science, Not Silence. The March for Science is a celebration of our passion for science and a call to support and safeguard the scientific community. Recent policy changes have caused heightened worry among scientists, and the incredible and immediate outpouring of support has made clear that these concerns are also shared by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. The mischaracterization of science as a partisan issue, which has given policymakers permission to reject overwhelming evidence, is a critical and urgent matter. It is time for people who support scientific research and evidence-based policies to take a public stand and be counted. On April 22nd, 2017, we walk out of the lab and into the streets. We are scientists and science enthusiasts. We come from all races, all religions, all gender identities, all sexual orientations, all abilities, all socioeconomic backgrounds, all political perspectives, and all nationalities. Our diversity is our greatest strength. A wealth of opinions, perspectives, and ideas is critical for the scientific process. What unites us is a love of science and an insatiable curiosity. We all recognize that science is everywhere and affects everyone. Science is often an arduous process, but it is also thrilling. A universal human curiosity and dogged persistence is the greatest hope for the future. The movement cannot and will not end with a march. Our plans for policy change and community outreach will start with marches worldwide and a teach-in at the National Mall. But it is imperative that we continue to celebrate and defend science at all levels, from local schools to federal agencies throughout the world. And I thought this was a very nice description of the project, and I think this march in general is extremely well-intentioned. And I've even talked with my wife about going and marching myself. However, as I've been a part of the Facebook group, it's become very prevalent that there's not a whole lot of agreement in terms of how to communicate exactly the kind of the ethos of this movement for science and science enthusiasts. And so basically, while this group is well-intentioned, I think it tends to demonstrate the communication problem among science among scientists and science enthusiasts in explaining what science is and how it ought to be represented. So when you go to the Facebook group page, you immediately notice that the little icon that it represents it is represented by a chemistry beaker. This is the limitations of Facebook and what is the closest thing that represents science. But right away we see this is, is this kind of icon meant to represent all of science? Obviously, that's not the only thing that scientists do, which is a certain form of chemistry. There's also the idea of, the knitting of these brain hats, where an image of a brain is somehow a representative or most iconic as a meaningful symbol or an idea node that communicates what science is. In thinking about that, we have to understand, if we're going to represent what science is with a brain, what kinds of values does that communicate? What does that say about what we're trying to do? And doing any of this and learning how to communicate, are we, again, I think the first instance was just maybe we should all wear white lab coats. Well, it's been said for many times that this is one of the big problems with communications and science is perpetuating these stereotypes of the lone individual genius in the lab coat, which, as we found, science is a very human endeavor, a very social endeavor, where individuals working in groups, disciplines aren't firmly bound, and it's just not. Basically, the idea is that science isn't the way we think it is. And this is a lot of what philosophers and history of philosophers of science will come to learn in time. And so my hope is that I will be taking this public oral communications class through, I suppose, in online ethnography. I hate to use that sort of technical term, or just basically exploring this page and trying to come to understand how is it that this self-organized group of folks who are scientists, science enthusiasts, are coming to understand what science is and how it should be represented. So I encourage you to add the group and to check this out. And if you yourself have any idea or thought as to how what this group is doing for the March for Science, and if there are any issues you see with it, please write into the show. Again, I'm very happy to read some responses on air, so you can write into the show. You can write to my email. That's Z as in zebra, AUTRA @indiana.edu. And if you have any thoughts on either the March for Science, the March for Science Facebook page, as well as any insight as to how you would teach a group of undergraduate students public oral communication with a themed history and philosophy of science focus. It is my hope that by examining the way in which these science and science enthusiasts are considering how to represent and talk about science, and how scientists are actually communicating, that they come to understand the important ideas such as in sympathetic, invitational, and transformational kinds of speeches. This is a experimental project and something that is somewhat of a short-term intervention pedagogical strategy that I'm hoping to do and ultimately develop a study from. So, with that being said, someone who I actually, after having talked with him, I consider to be an excellent scientific communicator in the philosophy of science, is our guest today, Anjan Chakravartty. Anjan's research, he's at the University of Notre Dame in the History and Philosophy of Science department. Anjan's research focuses on central issues in the philosophy of science, the metaphysics and epistemology of science, including topics in the philosophy of physics and biology. Much of his work revolves around debates concerning scientific realism, such as versions of entity realism and structural realism, and anti-realism, especially some versions of empiricism, as well as the nature of dispositions, causation, laws of nature, and natural kinds. He has worked on scientific modeling, representation, and attendant issues, such as the nature of abstraction and idealization, and the consequences these practices have for concepts such as knowledge and truth, as well as the relationship between science, metaphysics, and the philosophy of science. His next project, to which he will turn shortly, concerns the epistemology of scientific disagreement. And I must say, I talked with Anjan. He is currently at the University of Pittsburgh doing a fellowship there. And it was a terrific conversation. It was really great to hear his origin story and He has a lot of really insightful ideas and thoughts in terms of the methodology of doing philosophy of science and how it can be done successfully. And it was a real pleasure to talk with him. So I really do hope you enjoyed this interview. And without further ado, let's bring in Anjan. Hello. Welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this morning?
I am just fabulous. I'm spending a sabbatical at the University of Pittsburgh. It is a beautiful sunny day. The sun is streaming in through my window, and life couldn't be much better right now. Thank you for asking.
I'm so happy to hear that. I'm sitting in seeing the sun stream through my window as well in Bloomington, Indiana, not too far away. But I'm so happy to hear that the weather is nice in Pittsburgh. That's great. So, how long have you been hanging out over there?
Well, I've been here since September, I suppose. I'm on sabbatical this year, which is very nice.
Very nice.
Of course, I miss my colleagues back at Notre Dame, and they're doing all kinds of fun things in my absence. But it's really wonderful to be visiting here in the Center for Philosophy of Science. For the likes of us, there's so much going on that it can't help but be a super stimulating place to be.
Fantastic. And so you are, so just for the listeners to know, you are a philosopher of science working in the History and Philosophy of Science program at Notre Dame. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. In fact, the History and Philosophy of Science program at Notre Dame is a kind of interdisciplinary venture that's supported by the philosophy department and the history department. So my home is in the philosophy department.
Okay.
But I help to run the HPS program.
Right. Okay. So at Bloomington, we have what's called the Cognitive Science program, where the faculty members are housed often in or exclusively in programs like psychology and informatics, et cetera. So it sounds like a similar kind of setup at Notre Dame.
A very similar sort of thing, I think, yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm very excited to hear about your story, about your origins, how you found your way into philosophy of science. So why don't we start back at the beginning? So where do you grow up, Anjan?
Well, through some interesting quirks of fate, I ended up being born and growing up in a small town in southern Ontario in Canada called Peterborough. It's about 80 miles northeast of Toronto. My parents actually are both from India, and so the quirks were required because I think that they are probably still to this day the only members of their otherwise large families to actually leave India. They're from the northeast, Assam, where all the best tea comes from. It's an absolutely gorgeous place. It's all tea gardens and rice paddies in the foothills of the Himalayas. Absolutely beautiful part of the world. But they ended up in Canada, and so did I.
Well, that's pretty interesting. How did they come about making the move over from India?
Well, it's one of these funny things. I think something that isn't unfamiliar to people, certainly in the sciences. My father is a mathematician, and at a certain point, he'd done his master's degree in India and had become obsessed by a particular kind of function. And it just happened that one of the world-leading experts in that particular function was at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon in Canada. And so my father sent him a couple of papers and said, look, I'm really interested in this sort of thing. What do you think? And the guy wrote him back and said, you should come here and do a PhD.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So my father left India, came to Canada, did a PhD, went back to India afterward, but his former supervisor ended up being the first head of the math department at a small university that was born in the 1960s called Trent University in Peterborough. And he invited my father to come and visit. He visited for a little while, and just as he was leaving, these were different days, he dropped by to the president's office just to say goodbye. It was a small university then, and they all knew each other. And just as he was leaving, the president said, "Oh, by the way, would you like a job?"
Oh, wow.
And so after some consideration, I think my parents decided to stay. And the rest, as they say, is history, at least for me.
So he found his way as a professor in the math department?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
As a result, I ended up learning all sorts of weird facts about number theory as a child.
Yeah,
because he was very much a mathematician.
Yeah. I should say, I was going to say, one of the things I'd like to know is what was it like growing up in Peterborough, but what was it like growing up as the son of a mathematician?
Well, both good questions. I mean, I think my parents must have experienced some relatively severe culture shock moving from places of significant population density to a small town. I mean, Peterborough was probably about 55, maybe 60,000 people at the time. It's grown a little bit since. So really a different kettle of fish in terms of just everyday lifestyle. Of course, it was extraordinarily cold, lots of snow. And it was a lovely place to grow up. It's the city, they call it the Jewel of the Kawarthas. The Kawartha Lakes are a wonderful area, sort of cottage country, lots of different rivers and lakes. Just a magical place to grow up. It was the sort of place that by the time I left, I thought, well, this was a great place to grow up. I'm not sure I'd want to live here now that I'm a person of the world, or at least aspiring to be one. But it was really a wonderful place to grow up. And being the son of a mathematician, I hope my father will forgive me for saying this, but he was a stereotypical mathematician. He had his head in the clouds of various proofs and abstract issues. He was a pure mathematician, so he really had nothing like at least applied mathematicians to bring him back to the world of the concrete. And I think that was probably reflected in our childhood. Yeah. On the other hand, I was grateful because I had such a stimulating upbringing, learning all of these weird things about math, and it really stoked in me an interest in math, which has been a wonderful thing throughout the rest of my life, certainly as a foundation for interest in philosophy of science. You couldn't do better, really, than to have some math on your side.
Sure. What about mom? What was she interested in math as well, or was there completely opposite interest over there?
No, my mother had very different interests. In fact, she had been working on a master's degree in political science when she was in India. But, this is really a sign of the times. When my father got this job offer to come to Canada, and even before then, I think when he was offered the chance to visit, my mother really just suspended her educational aspirations and followed my father to North America. And so in some ways, I think I wish that my mother had had the opportunity, which really wasn't prevalent in a relatively conservative context in her upbringing, to pursue her scholarly ambitions in the way that my father had. But as I say, that was a sign of the times, and things are changing substantially now. But it was really different then.
Sure. No, I can certainly understand that. So as you're growing up, is this was it expected of you to study math or do some sort of scholarly pursuit, or what was it like at home?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, anyone who knows anything about at least the stereotype of Indian middle-class parents will tell you that there are only a few things that you're really supposed to do if you have the opportunity. I mean, first and foremost, you should become a doctor. That's kind of a no-brainer. Yeah. If you're not going to become a doctor, then you should probably become an engineer. If you're not going to be a doctor or an engineer, well, then I suppose desperation sets in. I mean, what could you possibly do that would make your life meaningful? Of course, there are other things that people do, and these days, certainly on the subcontinent, with the rise of IT and software development and engineering, that's a major career choice. But my parents, belonging to an earlier generation, were quite convinced that I should be a doctor. And they were so convinced that actually, for a while, I thought that I should be a doctor as well. Sure. And a lot of my early childhood was spent preparing for this imagined career as a doctor. I had home chemistry sets and child toy like stethoscopes that I would use on various family members and friends. And that was the very early childhood aspiration, although as things developed and I came into my own and started to develop my own preferences and desires, I realized that I might go in another direction.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about that. I mean, it sounds like there was some strong encouragement toward the sciences and medical sciences, at least, or things that could get you into medicine. But what did you, growing up, find yourself interested in on your own?
Well, I suppose my interest developed in large measure through the influence of my parents, even though I decided that medicine wasn't exactly the route that I was going to follow. Like a lot of immigrant parents who come to a place where their children can have the sorts of riches of opportunity that they themselves may not have had. We did everything as kids. I have a younger sister, and we did there were multiple music lessons. There were multiple sports that we were involved in. There was art camp. There was theater. There were all kinds of things. So while I think they had a very sincere respect and admiration for the sciences, they also wanted us to explore the humanities and the arts. And I think that combination of things, really being interested in the sciences, but also really being interested in the humanities was formative for me in ways that I couldn't have predicted back then. But now, when I look back through the way my own educational choices manifested over time, they all seem to have been chosen on the basis of the principle of giving up as little as possible, because I wanted to do the sciences, I wanted to do the humanities. So by the time it came to an actual choice, the choices that we all have to face up to eventually, we go on in academic training. As an undergraduate, I decided to study biophysics. That was my first degree. I specialized in biophysics, and that was in part a choice so as not to give up either biology or physics. I thought I would try to do both. And chemistry as well as a support for that venture. But at the same time, as I'm kind of fond of saying, I secretly, covertly did a major in philosophy on the side. I did some courses over the summers. I took some extra courses. And so by the time I graduated, it came to a surprise to the registrar that actually I'd qualified as having a specialism in biophysics, but also this major in philosophy.
So where was this? Was this at, I'm seeing here, University of Toronto? Was that?
That's right. Yeah. Toronto was the big city for a young lad from Peterborough. And of course, it's an eminent university in Canada, and it was a very exciting possibility for me as a teenager to imagine going to the University of Toronto. And as it turns out, it's an absolutely wonderful place. I mean, a huge university, and I think you can get lost there because it's so huge. But if you're lucky and you make the right choices and have, find some good mentors, the abundance of kinds of training that are available are just incredible. And I really benefited from that, I think, as an undergraduate.
Well, that sounds great. So when choosing to study biophysics, biology and physics, and then also philosophy, I mean, was there still in the background this plan to go into medicine, or was there already some sort of ideas of maybe not so much planning to do that?
Well, how intuitive of you, Nick. I did actually still have in the back of my mind the idea that I might go into medicine. The scholarly pursuits of the sciences and philosophy were also a big draw on my imagination. And at a certain point, it became clear to me that these things, at least, might not be all combinable into one career. And so I was really torn. I was interested in medicine not so much as a career choice with respect to practicing in the Western world. I wasn't really interested in it in that way. I was interested in it more in an international development sort of context. And I did actually spend 4 years in between degrees, going back and forth after my bachelor's degree, in between it and my master's degree, and then in between that and a PhD, going back and forth between my scholarly pursuits and these sort of vocational interests I had in international development.
Tell me a little bit about what. How would you describe international development? I'm just looking this up now.
Sure. Well, international development really comprises a whole suite of different kinds of approaches to ameliorating the situation of many people who live in socioeconomic circumstances that we would like to see improve for their benefit, and of course, perhaps in an ancillary way, for our own benefit, as we're able to interact with these people and making the world a better place.
Sure.
So that's a very abstract description of what international development is, but it takes very concrete forms. And one of the things I did for a year was I worked in Canada on, it was the first follow-up to the Earth Summit in Rio. Some people may remember that. It was called EcoEd. It was a Congress for Education and Communication on Environment and Development, and that actually took place in Toronto. So I worked on that. I actually spent a couple of years in India working in Calcutta on a very broadly based development project. There were some aspects of it that were really designed just to provide more emergency sort of relief for the large populations that live on the streets of the city. There's a large urban destitute population in Calcutta, as well as poor from surrounding rural areas, but also had more long-term development aspirations, and that there were training programs to try to provide people with skills that they could use to support themselves, spinning and weaving and carpentry. There were schools that were designed to take children who had fallen outside of the formal schooling system run by the government and bring them back up to speed, educate them so that they could then take exams to re-enter the formal government schooling system. So it was a pretty broad-based project, and I worked on that for a couple of years.
Wow. So did you grow up speaking Hindi as well?
I didn't, actually. My parents, coming from Assam, spoke Assamese.
Oh, okay.
And, India is a fascinating country linguistically. I think there are 15 national languages. So Hindi is one of them, but there are a lot of regional languages that are spoken primarily in those places. And I think when my parents were bringing up my sister and I, it was conventional wisdom at the time, now since debunked by many studies, that you shouldn't really speak more than one language to your children because they'll just get confused, and then there'll be a mess linguistically. So my parents spoke English to us. At the same time, they spoke Assamese to each other.
Sure.
And they listened to Assamese music, and they watched Assamese news and programs. So that was always in the background. And I found that when I went to Calcutta to work, Calcutta is actually in West Bengal, which is right beside Assam. And there they speak Bengali. Turns out that Bengali and Assamese have a lot of overlapping vocabulary. And I had, these linguistic primers kind of in the back of my head, and I picked up the language very, very quickly when I was there.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I was going to ask, was this your first time, I suppose, visiting Calcutta, or was this? Did you guys ever travel while growing up?
We traveled to India a couple of times when I was growing up. I think when I was 4 years old, we went to visit Assam for maybe 3 or 4 months. And I think probably at that time I picked up a lot of the language then too. Sure. And then lost it when I came back. Kids are like sponges with language. So I was probably speaking it relatively fluently by the time we left, and then lost it. And then again, when I was 9 years old, we went back to visit again for a few months. But between that time and the time that I went to actually work there, and this now would have been in my early 20s, I don't think I'd visited at all.
Okay, so I'm just curious. What was your overall impression? Being there for 4 years, it sounded like the work was really motivating and really interesting. What was it like for you?
Well, it was a combination of things. I mean, it's India in general is a kind of feast for your senses, all of them really, and working there, it really felt the same way. Certainly from both a professional perspective, but also just from a kind of an emotional perspective. The work that we were doing was the kind of thing that would present you with immense satisfaction and inspiration on a daily basis. It would also just break your heart on a daily basis. And, we would see things that were just awful. And sometimes we could help. And in other cases, there wasn't all that much we could do. Except to comfort people and, take whatever steps we could to just ease their suffering as opposed to really ameliorating their situations. So, that kind of life is very intense. And I think people who work in these contexts develop their own strategies for dealing with it and surviving. But there's no question that it was a demanding time. It was also an amazing time. And I wouldn't have traded it for anything.
Well, I think this in terms of not giving up things, it seems like this is a particular example of both, just having this multitude of experiences in Calcutta. It seems like something of doing really good work while at the same time, living a very humanistic experience. It sounds like. Do you feel? I should ask. How do you think maybe this experience, taking some time off from school, do you think it benefited you in any way, or it might have shaped the way in which you think about doing philosophy, maybe going on?
Well, I think it was huge for me, and it's something that, with some careful thought, I don't think anyone should do it lightly or without thinking about it, but with some thought, it's something that I would recommend to students that are coming up through for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is just that, we work hard sometimes as students when it comes right down to it, but the most important parts of the term and otherwise. And of course, the further along we go, the harder we work, and in a more sustained way, because it becomes impossible to do it in any other way. We work hard, and sometimes it's really helpful, I think, in refocusing your energies and your commitment and drive to pursue academic ventures, that you take a little break and maybe do something a little different. So I think it's useful in that regard, but also it can be useful in just helping you to work out what it is precisely that you want to do. Yeah. And I think in my case, it was huge for that reason, because as I mentioned, I was really torn in a way. I was thinking there's this career in international development that I could imagine being an extraordinarily fulfilling life, and it would be making a valuable contribution. On the other hand, I have these scholarly interests, and that might take me down an academic path where I would spend my life in a university, a very different kind of existence. It's not as though you can't, and in fact we do, I think, at the best of times make really significant contributions to society by working in that context, but it's a different kind of work. So what did I want to do? I knew that I couldn't do both. Here was a case where I couldn't just take all the things I was interested in and bundle them into one career.
And this is the constant pressure that I've met a lot of graduate students, or students even just thinking about right around your time in their mid-20s, and even later too, trying to figure it out. So how did it work out for you?
It really worked out beautifully. I mean, going back and forth between university and working in the field, I think allowed me to realize a few things. I mean, one of them was that although I was really entranced by the work that I was doing in the field in development, I knew that to really pursue that career, you would have to do what people do these days, which is to get higher qualifications. And, I might need to do a master's degree or a PhD in something like development economics or something. And I realized that my scholarly ambitions really lay in the direction of philosophy and the philosophy of science. And so I wasn't really interested in studying those things. I thought, when you've been doing some philosophy of science for a while, the conceptual demands of that field are so intriguing that when it came to something like development economics, I, and no doubt hubristically, thought, this is something I could learn on my own. I could read these books. I could understand these things. But to really study philosophy, I need some expert guidance. So that was one thing. The other thing I realized was that, as an academic, you have an amazing kind of freedom and flexibility with your time. I mean, we always complain that we don't have time because we're so busy. And of course, we are busy. And and there are amazing demands the more you take on. But we have a kind of flexibility with the way we plan our work and the way we approach our work that's almost unparalleled when you think about other careers. And I realized that I could stay involved with some of the development things that I was interested in just by making time for it as an academic. But that if I went into development, I could read philosophical authors on my own, but I would never grapple with them to the extent and to the degree that I was really passionate to do. And so that eventually made the choice quite simple for me. I knew that I wanted to go on in academia.
So, Excellent. An excellent story. So were there any, at the time, maybe this goes back to undergrad as well a little bit, particular authors or particular ideas that you were interested in grappling with, or that just were drawing you near?
Yeah, it started off as an interest in particular issues, and then very quickly I ended up finding certain authors that at once inspired and kind of infuriated me, and I thought, I really need to get to the bottom of some of these issues. But I suppose I was motivated in the first instance by certain issues. I mean, one thing that I was fascinated by when I was studying the sciences was this sense of having been tricked every year when I would come into a science class and have the teacher at the front say, those things that you learned last year, good for you for learning those things. Those are just approximations or idealizations to something that is really more serious. Now let's dig into those more serious things. And, fool me once, shame on someone, not me, someone else.
Sure.
But, after this happened a few times, I thought, wait a minute, there's something going on here, right?
Yeah.
We seem to be taught the sciences in a way that led us through increasingly accurate and, of course, more difficult, more rigorous, more challenging approximations to what we take cutting-edge science to be these days. And that by itself fascinated me. How is it that we've learned all these things, but then we take these things to not actually be the truth, that we take something else to be, and there's an interesting relationship between these things that we take to be not quite true and things that we take to be more approximately true. I was fascinated by that, but I was also just fascinated by conceptual issues that would arise in, I suppose, what we would call the foundations of science. When taking science courses, I would take a course in theoretical physics, and it was fascinating to me that the kinds of grounds for speculating about the existence of various kinds of subatomic things seem to be different from the kinds of grounds that we might offer when thinking about the existence of various things in chemistry or biology that we might be theorizing about or creating models for. And all of a sudden I started thinking about the basis for these knowledge claims. I mean, when do we think that we're in good enough shape? When do we think that we have warrant enough to make these sorts of claims about some of these things are very exotic sorts of entities with very exotic properties, and when not? And when I started talking to my my science professors about this sort of thing, they were incredibly indulgent, and I think there I was very lucky because they could have just said, "Don't worry about that. Just shut up and calculate." But they didn't. They said, these are really good questions, and here's what I think, but if you really want to get to the bottom of some of these issues and grapple with them seriously, I recommend you go down the road to the philosophy department. There are some philosophers of science there, and that's their day job. They think about these things. So I got some good advice.
So do you think, I know Toronto has a history and philosophy of science program. Was that around at the time when you were studying, or maybe there were some nascent connections perhaps between some of the scientists and philosophers there?
There were connections between scientists, philosophers there, and the Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology did exist at the time I was an undergraduate, but amazingly, I didn't actually know that it existed. I mean, this is one of the hilarious things about being a student in a large university.
Yeah, there's so many programs.
Yeah, but beyond that, I think it's not uncommon, I think, for people who might have an interest in philosophy of science or history of science or sociology of science not to realize that there are such programs, maybe even nearby, just because they're relatively few and far between. So having done some philosophy and then increasingly realizing that I was passionate about it and then realizing that there was such a thing as philosophy of science, I actually spent a lot of my time in the philosophy department, and only later did I discover that there was this thing called history and philosophy of science.
Okay. So it sounds like you'd made the decision at some point and to move back to Canada or to North America. So what was next after doing some work in international development in graduate career?
Well, I made the fateful decision. I came back and did a master's degree in philosophy, also at the University of Toronto. And that was really designed in my own mind to sort of consolidate my background in philosophy, since I'd spent so much time as an undergraduate in the sciences.
Sure.
And then I took another year off, so this was the fourth one in the four that I mentioned, while I not only did various applications for graduate school, but I also had some fun living out on the West Coast in Vancouver for a year.
Oh, nice.
I spent a lot of the time working in the physics department while I was out there doing some fun things and also doing a lot of hiking and kayaking and other things while I got all of my applications for grad school together. So there was a year there, and then I took off for graduate school.
Oh, it's beautiful. So I imagine just hiking in and around British Columbia was what you were up to.
That was the order of pretty much every weekend. That's right.
Oh, that's fun.
I did do some serious work while I was there.
Sure. Well, I mean, I completely understand. Sure. And it sounds, so what was, did you enjoy working in the physics lab?
Oh, it was really fun. I mean, I did a number of things. Some fantastic work going on there. There's a particle accelerator not so far away, so people were doing some really interesting work. Some of the things that I enjoyed most were things that were more everyday. You might think of them as being more banal, but were kind of fascinating from, again, a philosophy of science or an HPS perspective. One of the things I did was to think about and help revamp the undergraduate lab experiments that science students do, which anyone who's had undergraduate training in the sciences will know is always a kind of test of your mettle, because you go into these labs and you try to perform these experiments and they don't work. Yeah. And then you're not sure exactly how to write them up. Should you be completely forthcoming about the fact that you got a result that's completely the opposite of what you were supposed to get? Or, should you try to explain it away somehow? What should you do? So that was kind of fun. We worked with some of the experiments and tried to revamp them in ways that would be fun for the students, but also maybe end up being a little bit less frustrating than they certainly had been for me.
Oh, very cool. Is there, do you happen to remember any favorite experiment you conceived or revamped?
Well, I'm not sure that I can take credit for having conceived of any of these things, although I was part of a group that did think about them. But one of the things that there were a couple of things that I really liked myself. One of them was working on the experiment in which you look at the spectral lines of something like hydrogen. So just working with that sort of setup I really enjoyed. And the other was sort of measuring the charge on an electron, a sort of Millikan-type experiment. That, of course, he did over 100 years ago, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So those were some things that I really enjoyed. I have to admit that also as a biophysicist, I really enjoyed some of the wet work that we did later on, that sort of program where you actually take nerves and you do funny things to them and see what happens.
Oh, wow. Oh, I'd be interested to see. So what kinds of funny things would you do?
Oh, well, they were probably more funny to me than they would be to most people. But no, we conducted a bunch of experiments where you just provide tissues with various kinds of stimulation, and then you observe what happens. As an undergraduate in labs over the summer, I would work in a lab in which we were trying to gauge the exact mechanism of muscle contraction and to understand how muscles and nerves recovered after certain kinds of injury. And so we would perform experiments on muscle tissues, and that was incredibly fun, but also, as anyone who's had some experience with lab work knows, incredibly slow moving and in some ways, tedious. And so when you're running a lab, it's quite fun because you get the students and your PhD students to do all this work. Sure. But as a student, I think that might have also been helpful in convincing me that philosophy was the right way to go.
Yeah, so I noticed, you finished your MA at Toronto in philosophy to kind of lay some of the more foundation in traditional philosophy, and then you went off to do a year of work. I mean, so was this particularly strategic in terms of preparing for a philosophy degree, or was this also a way in which to maybe do a science degree in the future, or what were you thinking at the time, if you can recall?
Actually, at that time, I think I decided that I was going to go into the philosophy of science. I discovered that it was there. I'd investigated it. I knew that I was going to do it. I think it was more strategic at that point. I just thought I wasn't quite ready yet to apply. I wanted to do some careful thinking myself about what I might want to pursue. I wanted to let the transcripts from the previous year, get finalized and
sure. So
ready.
Well, it certainly seems like the waiting and the sort of patience paid off, because it turns out you made the jump to Cambridge. Was that right? And PhD.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I had have to admit a really tough time deciding where to go, but it ended up being a wonderful decision for me. Yeah, I was lucky. I was considering coming here to Pittsburgh to do my PhD, which of course would have been wonderful. It's a great department. I had the opportunity to go to University of California, San Diego, which I knew.
Also a great program, yeah.
Also a wonderful program. And by the way, if people haven't seen it, when you get the prospectus from the University of California, San Diego, at least back then, the first 3 or 4 pages of it, it doesn't say anything about the university. It's just pictures of the Pacific Ocean looking over bluffs
come
from
here,
the university.
Come here. Yeah.
It's just unbelievably nice. So, that was a real draw, I have to admit. Then in England, there was the London School of Economics, which is a great department. Yeah. And then Cambridge. And again, I found myself really torn. But ultimately, just the romance of going to a medieval university really won me over. Cambridge was founded in the early 1200s. And so the idea of being in a kind of magical medieval university, and then I visited and was even more sold. I mean, it's just a beautiful place. It's an inspiring place to be if you're interested in the history and or philosophy of science, because there are all these markers around. The History and Philosophy of Science department is in the old Cavendish laboratories. The science laboratories, Cavendish laboratories, are now in a much more modern site, and they've developed all of that infrastructure. But the old Cavendish laboratories are the site of the History and Philosophy of Science program there. And, you're walking down the street and there's a plaque just saying, oh, this is where J.J. Thomson discovered the electron. or this is where Watson and Crick revealed the structure of DNA molecules. Or, there's so much wonderful science that happened there. And of course, the program was wonderful. It offered me a real variety of things. And because as I've already confessed, I had these interests that span a number of different areas. It was a really wonderful place for me to go.
So, it sounds like a difficult decision, but a good decision. And I'm sure things, could have, talking counterfactually, could have turned out in whatever which way. But it sounds like I can certainly understand the choice to go to Cambridge. So what kinds of issues while you were in graduate school? What were you interested in working on then?
Well, the thing that really brought me to the graduate program was a fascination with issues surrounding scientific realism.
Yeah.
So scientific realism, just to
give a general
first approximation, is the idea that our best scientific theories, however you decide which ones those are describing the nature of a mind-independent reality, that is a world that doesn't really depend on how we think about it. And in so doing, it's telling us things that are true, or at least close to the truth, approximately true, about that world. So scientific realism is really a kind of optimistic attitude towards the outputs of our best science, that it's really capturing something accurately, descriptively accurate about the nature of the world. And it turns out that, as philosophers are wont to do, we think about this a little bit and we realize that there are all sorts of skeptical reasons that might shake your faith in that kind of attitude. And once you start to take those seriously, as I think we should, then it becomes unclear how scientific realism might be best defended, whether there are versions of scientific realism that are more convincing than other ways of thinking about scientific realism, whether some skeptical challenges really should revise the way we commit to this sort of knowledge or not. Are they defeasible? And those sorts of issues, were really interesting to me, in part because they, I think, flowed very naturally from the sorts of foundational questions that I'd become interested in as a science student myself. And it turned out that Cambridge was a wonderful place for doing that. There were some wonderful general philosophers of science. My own supervisor was the late, great Peter Lipton.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But there also, it was a great place for philosophy of physics, and some of the parts of my thesis turned on issues there. Michael Redhead was there, and Jeremy Butterfield was there. He left for a while, but is back there in Cambridge. And some parts of my thesis were very metaphysics-y. They turned on some issues in metaphysics, and Hugh Miller, the storied metaphysician, was there. So I just had great support for thinking about these kinds of issues.
Well, that sounds fascinating. So it's really good to hear that. I know that a lot of departments now, it's not always the case that a lot of general philosophy of science work is done or encouraged, which I think I don't know. Would you say that's accurate, or is it just depends on where you go?
I think that that's probably fair. At least it's certainly something that I've thought a number of times throughout my career. If you look back on my own career, in some ways, I feel as though I've been the beneficiary of a lot of luck, and I think everyone needs to. There's always luck involved in making a career in the humanities and in academia more generally. But also, given some of the choices I made, you might think, they were counterintuitive. I mean, one, even the focus on issues on scientific realism.
Sure.
I remember when I said that that's what I was interested in, there were some people, not in Cambridge, I have to give them credit, they were incredibly supportive, but some people elsewhere who said, well, why would you want to work on that? Everything that could be said about that constellation of issues was said in the 1980s, so, why do you want to return to them? And so, I think there's a story to be told about why that turned out to be a kind of inspired choice, even though some people may have doubted it at the time. And also, with respect to the question of general philosophy of science, more broadly, I mean, the issue of scientific realism is a quintessential issue within general philosophy of science. I think that there's no question that if you look at the development of our scholarly discipline over the last couple of decades, the move has been to ever greater specialization. Right? You are a philosopher of X, you're a philosopher of evolutionary biology, or you're a philosopher of space and time. Or you're a philosopher of chemistry, or you're a philosopher of, whatever X most appeals to you. And so you might think that, that means that it's general philosophy of science, the kinds of things that people worried about when they thought, what are laws of nature? What are scientific explanations? What should we think about realism and anti-realism? All these sorts of questions might have just been left by the side of the road as these ever greater moves towards specialization took hold. And so in some ways you might say, well, my career is a bit of a miracle in that I do consider myself a general philosopher of science, even though I have some more specific interests in philosophy of biology and philosophy of physics. But here's the thing. I think that, first of all, when a field does move in the direction of greater specialization, it can do one of two things. It can conceive of itself as just a collection of unrelated subdisciplines and not really worry about whether it fits together at all. Or it can think of itself as a group of projects that actually do fit together in meaningful and interesting ways. And I think as philosophers, we're often primed to think about that latter question. Do all of these subdisciplines fit together in interesting and important ways? And I think the conclusion is that, look, there are all kinds of ways in which looking at these subdisciplines is really informative, because we see that there are differences, methodological differences, differences in the sorts of knowledge claims and explanations we might want to give. But at the same time, these are subdisciplines that really inform a larger understanding of what science is and how it works and what kinds of knowledge we get out of it. And I don't think that you can make those kinds of connections unless you have general philosophy of science. So, ironically, in the move towards greater specialization, I think that the role of general philosophy of science has come to the fore in a perhaps unexpected way as the unifier of these different disciplines. And that, again, isn't to say that they should all amount to the same thing, that laws of nature should be the same thing in one subdiscipline or another. But it gives us a way of thinking about what these connections might be. And thank goodness, because it means that I've been able to pursue the things that I'm interested in. And if you look at the kinds of work that are being done these days, there's a healthy smattering of issues in general philosophy of science that are really at the heart of the field.
So it sounds to me, so I don't know if this connection is going to make sense, but a lot of folks, so people in the sciences talk about what's called translational science, which is bringing together and working at the intersection of different science fields. And so it sounds like to me what you might be talking about is working at the intersection of different philosophy of science subfields. We're describing general philosophy of science in that way. And I think I'm not sure if it's the case, but it's often maybe uncharitably, general philosophy of science can be uncharitably characterized as not necessarily paying attention to the specialty subfields, or toward the greater specialization and just doing that. But that's not the way one must do for general philosophy of science. Do you think, is that accurate, or is there, I'm trying to, I'm quite enlightened by the way in which you're describing the way in which general philosophy of science has arisen. So, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly think that the kind of intersectional work that you're describing is part of it. Mm-hmm. So I think that looking at what these different subdisciplines generate in terms of conclusions regarding their own branches of science and thinking about whether there are commonalities is certainly a task. It's one of the bona fide things that general philosophers of science can do. But I also think that there are other sorts of projects that don't take looking at intersectionality necessarily as a starting point.
Sure.
You might, for example, as I have in my own work, become interested in issues of scientific realism. I have interests in the epistemology of science. I have interests in the metaphysics of science, what people these days sometimes are referring to as scientific metaphysics or naturalized metaphysics. And here, what I often attempt to do is to develop accounts that seem to jive with the impressions, the educated impressions that we have of the way science works and functions, and then to look at specific cases to test it, as it were, to see whether the kinds of views that we're generating as general philosophy of science gain purchase in different sub-areas. And I think the discoveries are quite fascinating. Sometimes they do, sometimes they need to be amended. Sometimes that reveals interesting differences between different kinds of sciences.
Very, very fascinating. That makes a lot of sense. So in your thesis work, going back a little bit, what was the general claim or the overall idea that you were putting forward in relation to scientific realism?
Right. Well, the central claim that I made in my thesis is something that then was elaborated in my first book. And it was essentially the claim that if you look at the most defensible conceptions of scientific realism that have emerged in the last couple of decades, I take them to have emerged in response to some really searching and excellent probing by anti-realists, or people who might otherwise be skeptical about realism. What you find is different approaches to realism that on the surface seem as though they're conflicting or contradictory. And the basic thesis of my PhD dissertation work is that if we take a more careful look at these seemingly contradictory approaches to realism, it turns out that there's a way of interpreting them such that they're actually compatible with one another. And I called this position that arises once you see the compatibility that's sort of inherent in these different approaches, I call the position that emerges SemiRealism.
Yes, I saw one of your papers on that. Yeah.
Right, and that ended up becoming the basis of my first book. Now, I should mention that, as is often the case, the relationship between my thesis, my PhD thesis, and my first book is sort of like the relation between a proposition and its negation. I mean, I had a bunch of ideas in the dissertation work that I pursued in various directions. The book is really a different kettle of fish, but it shares with that early work that I did as a graduate student this idea that if we look carefully at our most promising approaches to scientific realism, it's possible to extract the strengths of those positions and leave aside some of their weaknesses in a way that we have a richer understanding of what scientific realism is. And that's what I called semi-realism, and that's what I developed in my first book.
Fantastic. So, moving on from your great work at Cambridge, where were you off to next? What was next in your journey?
Well, I had a probably atypical path towards the next stage in my journey. I had the opportunity to do a couple of things. I ended up doing both of them. As I was getting towards the end of my PhD program, I thought, well, I'm going to apply for what in England are called JRFs, Junior Research Fellowships. They're sort of like postdocs. You don't need to be finished your PhD to get one, so it's unlike a postdoc in that way. But it's like a postdoc in the sense that when you get them, you're not really considered a student anymore, even if you're finishing up. They're sort of like faculty positions. But for very junior people, and they don't involve any teaching necessarily, so it's very much like a postdoc. And there are a bunch of them in England, so I thought, I'm going to try to get one of these, because that would be wonderful. They tend to be 3 years, sometimes 4 years long, so it's a really nice thing to do.
Wow, yeah.
But at the same time, I'm looking at the jobs for philosophers. There were a few things that caught my eye that I just thought, if I were lucky enough to get one of those things, I wouldn't be able to say no, even if I did get a junior research fellowship. So I applied for, I think, 3 jobs. And I was really lucky. I got a junior research fellowship, and then just around about the same time, I think it was in the same week, I got a job back at the University of Toronto, where I had come from originally. And I managed to work it out so that I didn't stay for the whole of my junior research fellowship. I stayed for a couple of years. It was a 4-year position. I stayed for a couple of years, which was good because I actually needed to finish my PhD. So I spent part of the first year doing that.
Perfect. Yeah.
And then after that, I jumped back across the Atlantic and started in the philosophy department at the University of Toronto.
How was it returning home, so to speak, to Toronto from all of these travels from Calcutta to Cambridge? What was that like to return back to Canada?
It was really fun. I mean, I was not sure exactly what it would be like.
Sure.
There's always that trepidation of coming back to a place where you yourself were a student, because of course some of my colleagues in the philosophy department, in fact a lot of them, were people that I had previously seen as these wise sage-like figures on a hill.
Yep.
That were teaching me in classes, and now all of a sudden we were colleagues, and I wondered whether that would be weird. And sometimes there's a weirdness associated just with coming back to places that you once knew well but had left and you kind of thought of as being in your past. But, as it turns out, it was really a wonderful experience. I mean, for one thing, Toronto had changed a lot in the intervening time, so it was like rediscovering a new place. Also, as a student, I'm sure many students are more adventurous than I was, but as an undergraduate student, I think I probably didn't leave a 1 mile radius of the campus for those 4 years. So there was a whole city to discover.
Yeah.
And also, I think I'd been away long enough that when I turned up and had all of these former sage-like people as colleagues, it just felt natural, and they were incredibly welcoming.
Oh, well, that's great to hear. I was always curious because I've heard a couple stories of people returning to being fortunate enough to receive some great work or to a faculty position in the place that they've studied, and it being weird then to work as alongside those who you once saw as up on the hill. So I'm glad to hear it worked out though. So it sounds like you did about 5 or 10 years, or around 10 years or so at Toronto. Was this most of the time working in a split between general philosophy of science and philosophy of physics, or what kinds of things were you interested in?
It was really a mix of things. So I was hired by the philosophy department. Within a year, I had moved my office into the Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, which I then certainly knew existed. So I was cross-appointed in both places. I had a home in philosophy and in the Institute. And my work was really centered on a few things. I mean, the realism debate is ultimately a debate in the epistemology of science, so I was still focused on a lot of those epistemological issues. But I became increasingly interested in a kind of movement that's become popular and has attracted a lot of attention in the philosophy of science over the past couple of decades, and that's work in the metaphysics of science. And, I see my own work as bridging some divides between general philosophy of science and, as I mentioned before, philosophy of biology and philosophy of physics. Certainly, some of the issues I'm concerned with in general philosophy of science, thinking about scientific taxonomy or scientific kinds. Are they natural kinds? Are they constructed kinds? How should we think about our classificatory practices in the sciences? That's a topic in general philosophy of science, but I've really sought to think about that in the context of, say, theorizing in biology. Some of my interests, again, in general philosophy of science, thinking about the nature of scientific entities and their properties. How should we think about them so as to make realism a plausible view about scientific knowledge? End up being really interestingly challenged in certain areas of physics, where it's very difficult to make sense of the idea that there are entities that have properties in the everyday ways that we normally think of tables and chairs as existing and having properties. So I became interested in certain areas of the philosophy of physics through that. So I like to, hopefully not in a dilettantish kind of way, bridge different areas of the philosophy of science. And I think that has been a really fun thing for me to do.
So you mentioned your interest in philosophy of metaphysics, scientific metaphysics, and I just actually happened to pull up one of what looks to be like a review article or an introductory article where you start off by saying, recent philosophy of science has been seized by what may appear a schizophrenic attitude toward analytic metaphysics. Could you say a little bit more about that in terms of...
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, it's the subject of a book that I have just finished working on a little while ago, and it should be coming out in a few months.
Great.
So maybe I'll tell you a little bit about what I had in mind in that quotation, and then say a little bit more just by way of telling you, how I've developed that idea in the book.
Sure.
So the schizophrenic attitude that I was referring to there concerns, on the one hand, the idea that has become very popular. There's now a Metaphysics of Science Society. There's a Society for the Metaphysics of Science. You see this being a great source of interest in various departments in Europe, but also in North America. There are sessions now at the APA in the group sections, the American Philosophical Association, on metaphysics of science. So you see, I think, an increasing thirst and interest in the idea that, to really understand some of the implications of what our best science is telling us about what's in the world and what those things are like, we need to probe the outputs of the sciences using some of the tools of metaphysics. What kinds of entities are being described? How should we think of them? What kinds of laws of nature do our investigations of their behavior support? And so on. So you start to get this idea that doing metaphysics is actually important to doing philosophy of science.
Wow.
Now, that's an attitude that I think, as I said, increasingly people have had, resulting in conferences and the development of these societies and sessions and workshops. On the other hand, there's been a movement within the philosophy of science to say, wait a minute, metaphysics, right? Especially what people have branded analytic metaphysics or speculative metaphysics, by which I think they mean just metaphysics in ways that doesn't pay what they would recognize as due or sufficient attention to the sciences, is really beyond the pale epistemically. That is, it's a kind of theorizing about what there is in the world and what those things are like that doesn't really latch onto the world in any meaningful way. We don't have any reason to think that those kinds of philosophical pursuits are actually telling us anything about what we really want to know. And that if you want to if you want to engage in that kind of endeavor, well, then you should really be a philosopher of science, because we're in the business of interpreting our best science. Now, those two attitudes I take to be on their face very different. One is a kind of pro-metaphysics attitude with respect to interpreting scientific theories. Another is a kind of anti-metaphysics attitude.
Yep.
And part of what I've tried to do in some of my recent work is to think about that relationship and to give what I take to be a healthier diagnosis of how we should think about the relationship between metaphysics and the philosophy of science and science. And that's part of the book project.
Well, that's fascinating. When can we look forward to that book?
Well, it's coming out with Oxford University Press. I think it's slated for release late in the spring, so it really should just be a few months now. It's called Scientific Ontology.
Okay.
So it's really about the pursuit of investigations that are designed to tell us what things and kinds of things there are in the world and what those things are like. And I suppose I argue for two main theses in the book. I mean, one of them is that the ways in which some people have tried to bridge the divide between what I described a moment ago as these very different attitudes towards metaphysics, right, kind of pro and anti in the philosophy of science, is to say, look, doing metaphysics is okay. It's a perfectly sensible thing to do, in fact, in trying to understand what our best scientific theories say, so long as it's done in the right sort of way. And the right sort of way is doing it in a way that is, and here's where certain metaphors kick in, it's constrained by the sciences, or it's substantively informed by the sciences, or it's grounded in scientific knowledge. And part of what I argue in the book is that a lot of these metaphors really haven't been cashed out in ways that really allow us to understand what it means to do the metaphysics of science in a way that's different from doing any other sort of metaphysics or just doing philosophy of science. So the first part of the book is really an attempt to spell out what a naturalized metaphysics, that is a metaphysics that's done in conjunction with our thinking about the sciences, could look like. And so that's one thesis. The other major thesis of the book is just to suggest that, and this I think will be a controversial thesis, but it's one that I think is right, is that it turns out that the decision as to where to draw the line between domains of theorizing about naturalized metaphysics that we think will yield warranted beliefs and domains of thinking in which we think, well, maybe we should just suspend belief there. Maybe we don't have a strong enough warrant to believe what these kinds of philosophical projects are generating. I take that line to be something that can be drawn in different places, and there's no one right place to draw that line. And so defending that kind of pluralism is something I do in the latter part of the book.
Well, it sounds like a very worthwhile project, and I'm very excited. Yeah, this is something I really will take on. I mean, I myself have seen metaphysics like conferences and groups pop up here and there in the philosophy of science, and it's not common we see a lot of graduate courses in metaphysics of science. So, yeah, I'm thrilled to see you working on this project. So, I'm very excited to see it come out.
Excellent.
So we're getting a little bit toward the end. Sorry to keep you over time a little bit on our chat, but I've really enjoyed it so far. So I mean, we're heading toward the present day, where working in Toronto, you around 2011 moved on to take a position at Notre Dame in their History and Philosophy of Science program. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
So how did that transition come about? What was going on there?
Well, it came about in a way that I hadn't really expected. It really came about by way of a kind of tap on the shoulder. Some colleagues at Notre Dame said, hey, what do you think about joining our philosophy department at our program in History and Philosophy of Science? And, as you go on throughout your career, opportunities like this arise from time to time, and I was very happy in Toronto. I thought that I could happily spend the rest of my life there. But there were certain things about Notre Dame that I found intriguing, and the more I thought about it, the more intrigued I became. And ultimately, be careful what doors you open, because one thing can lead to another. And I decided that it would be a really fun thing to do. The program at Notre Dame and the program at Toronto are very similar in some ways. I mean, both departments have excellent philosophers of science. Both departments have a lot of philosophers of science. Both are huge philosophy departments. Toronto is the largest philosophy department in North America, and Notre Dame is the second largest philosophy department in North America.
Wow.
So there are a lot of commonalities, actually, between the setups in both places. But the more I talked to colleagues at Notre Dame, the more I saw certain synchronicities between the sorts of things I was interested in and what they were pursuing. It's also true that there's a difference in scale that I thought might be appealing. The University of Toronto, which I love, and I love Toronto, is it's a very huge university. There are 80,000 students at the University of Toronto.
Yeah.
Whereas Notre Dame is a small institution, relatively speaking. There are 12,000 students there. And when I visited, I really got the sense that there's a very intimate community of people for whom it's much easier to sort of see each other and work with one another on a regular basis. And I was just taken when I visited with the atmosphere there. So this isn't to say anything negative about Toronto, which I love, but I thought it would be a nice time to try something new. I saw a lot of promise at Notre Dame, and I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure discovering Chicago, which I think is a great city. And which is
how close? Notre Dame must be, what is that, an hour away from Chicago, or is it even?
It depends on the part of the city you're going to. So a lot of people who go back and forth between Notre Dame and Chicago are going to the University of Chicago, and that's just over an hour. It's in the south part of the city.
Sure.
We actually are lucky enough to have an apartment, a condo, right downtown Chicago. So we spent a lot of time there, and from our place near Notre Dame to our place in Chicago, it's more like an hour and a half.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, so do you spend quite a bit of time in Chicago, I can imagine, or?
We do. We spend a lot of time going back and forth. I travel a lot during the academic year, so probably every other weekend we try to spend a long weekend there. We call it the cottage. We say, hey, do you want to go to cottage this weekend? We say, sure. So we go. But otherwise, we're kind of based at Notre Dame. And then in the summer, we just turn that around. We're sort of based in Chicago and come to Notre Dame.
Fantastic. Is this you and your partner? Or?
That's right. Yeah. My wife and I.
Oh, great. Wow. Is she interested in philosophy as well, or is this other kinds of things as well?
She's become increasingly interested in philosophy. So this, I didn't give you all of the reasons for our move to Notre Dame, but let me just chip in one other one.
Sure.
My wife had, after not pursuing the PhD in philosophy that she'd always wanted to do, because other things came up and she was working, she decided, perhaps, I don't want to take too much credit for this, but through some irresponsible encouragement of my own, knowing that she had always wanted to do it and just hadn't, for one reason or another, encouraged her, and she ultimately decided, yeah, that's a great idea. And since she had already done 2 degrees at the University of Toronto, an undergraduate degree and a master's degree, she was thinking about going elsewhere. And that was right about the time that Notre Dame came knocking. And as it turns out, there were excellent people in English literature in her areas of interest that she was quite keen to work with at Notre Dame. So that worked out very nicely for us as well. So she's also had a great time at Notre Dame. We really enjoy Chicago. The surprising thing for me has been not that we enjoy going to Chicago and spending time there as pedestrians walking around the way we used to in Toronto, but that I actually love coming back to the northern Indiana countryside. It's just, it's a wonderful feeling. We live in a kind of semi-pastoral area. There are birds singing in the tree outside my window. I just love it.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, one of our fellow graduate students has, his wife is currently doing I believe it's, I want to say a playwriting or a creative writing degree up at Notre Dame. So he's constantly going over there, and I'm wondering, he's always there. And so now it sounds like there's some good reason to be spending your time in northern Indiana. It sounds like a great space.
Yeah.
Well, great. So, we've come to the end. So you're currently now, so I actually just pulled up your thing. Did you recently receive a Guggenheim Fellowship?
I did, or as my nephew called it when I told him, a Googlyheim Fellowship.
Googlyheim Fellowship, yeah. Well, congratulations. That's quite an award. That's a very esteemed honor.
Well, thank you very much. I was just as surprised as the next person when the good news came through. But, because like all of these things, there's so much luck involved, and, there are a lot of amazing applications that go through, and then somehow a dart gets thrown at one of them. But I was very happy to be hit by that dart, and it's been a wonderful thing, actually, to have that fellowship.
Fantastic. Well, so, we've come to the end. You're working at Pitt now. Is there anything you would like to share with the listeners of the podcast, or maybe about the graduate program or your new work, anything at all?
Sure. Why don't I just mention a couple of things?
Sure.
One of them, just to take you up on your invitation to say something about the graduate program, as we've already mentioned, in addition to the philosophy program in the philosophy department at Notre Dame, there is this program in history and philosophy of science, and I think it's relatively unique at Notre Dame and having certain features that I think are quite wonderful. I mean, one of them is that it is a program to which you apply independently. So in other words, you will get a PhD in history and philosophy of science.
Okay.
But the way we've organized the program is that every student who is in the program is also in either the philosophy department or the history department. So that we have the students in our program fulfill all the requirements in either philosophy or history. But then we add some extra things to, add some extra flavor to the curriculum of students in HPS so that they end up graduating as, especially tasty academics with a variety of skills. And I think that's a really nice thing. I mean, it does make it a very rigorous and demanding training in some ways because there are serious requirements. On the other hand, it allows you to not only, with absolute honesty, pass yourself off as a philosopher with all the kinds of trainings that philosophers get, and at the same time, a philosopher of science or a historian of science with all of the kinds of specialty training that we might like people who have gone that interdisciplinary route to have. So that's just a little description of part of what makes the program there unique. And of course, we're always happy to talk to people who are interested in that program.
Well, I will certainly pass along some information to any students or interested master's students who are interested in going on. And I must say, I really appreciate that that strategy in terms of organizing the curriculum. I know it's the case that folks getting into history and philosophy of science, there has been some concern about whether they, in the end, can and will pass themselves off as historians or philosophers once, time comes to apply for jobs. And by guaranteeing that your students will come out disciplined in both and specialized, I think is a really, really great for their future careers.
I think it's a really nice thing. And it also allows us to really pay respect to the fact that HPS is a very broad tent. There are people who are doing very deeply integrated interdisciplinary work that involves both philosophy and history. There's some people who are doing things that are more narrowly philosophical or more narrowly historical, and we can facilitate all of those kinds of projects with the system that we have, and I think that's a nice thing.
And has it helped foster connections, I suppose, between the history and between programs and departments?
I think it has. Yeah, the HPS program has a wonderful identity unto itself, and I think this is not uncommon in places like Bloomington and other places where there are programs in HPS. It fosters a kind of wonderful community spirit where people who are interested, what links all of these people? They're interested in humanistic approaches to understanding the sciences. And there's some things that you just can't get from your colleagues in your own area of specialization. But that can amount to amazing forms of stimulation from people who have different disciplinary approaches to, one and the same set of scientific issues. So it creates a wonderful sense of community that by its nature draws people in from the sciences, draws them in from different disciplines in the humanities. And, what a life. It's fantastic.
Well, Anjan, it's been a real pleasure getting to chat with you, and I thank you for being so forthcoming about your story and your journey through here to to where you are today. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, Nick, it's been a great pleasure for me. Thanks so much for doing these podcasts. I think it's a wonderful idea, and it's really been fun for me to participate. So thank you.
Well, great. Well, yeah, good luck the rest of the semester out there. I might be taking an adventure over there at some point, either to a conference, and if I do, I will be sure to say hello.
Excellent. Definitely drop me a line.
Okay. Well, take care, Anjan. Have a good rest of your day. We'll talk to you soon.
All the best.